Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Dean Smith, Associate Professor in the Department of History at UT Austin and co-organizer with Dr. Rosario Inez Granados of the Distinguished Visiting Speakers in the Art of the Spanish Americas series. A very, very warm welcome to everyone here this evening for our webinar on Silver's Myth of the Americas. The Blanton has been organizing these Distinguished Visiting Speaker series since the spring of 2017, with the objective of drawing attention to the art of the Spanish Americas across campus here at UT Austin, but also outside of it. And we would like to acknowledge the support of the following: the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Fine Arts, and the School of Architecture at UT Austin in all of these endeavors. Our moderator for this evening is, of course, Dr. Rosario Inez Granados, and I'm going to turn our webinar over to Rosario for our presentations. Rosario?
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everybody who is now joining us from different parts of the globe, I imagine. It's indeed a pleasure to have you, all of you here, and join this conversation with Professor Kris Lane and Andrés de Leo, who now you can see on the screen. We're going to have the same structure that we have followed from different times. First, we're going to listen to Andrés' presentation, then we're going to have a little bit of questions to him, and then we're going to follow with Kris Lane's presentation, then followed by a little bit of discussion about his own paper, and then we're going to join and open up the questions for all of you. Remember, your audio is muted, so no one can hear you, and you only see the panelists visible on the screen. And in a little while, we're going to see their presentations as well. We'll be taking your questions from the Q&A window if you look at the bottom of your screen. So please don't use the chat panel. It's better if you use the Q&A so we can keep track of your participation. We can incorporate that in the discussion at the second half of this webinar. I think that being said, we can start. Andrés, if you can turn on your camera, please. Justin is going to be helping us with PowerPoint, but I just want to say, Andrés de Leo is researcher at Centro de Investigación y Conservación del Patrimonio de la Universidad de Ingeniería y Tecnología del Perú. He holds an M.Arch from the Universidad Autónoma de Oaxaca and a PhD from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. He co-curated the exhibition Plus Ultra, Platería Religiosa de la Nueva España, that was open to the public from October 2020 to February 2021 at Casa de México in España. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about his curatorial perspective on this show. Thank you, Andrés.
Hi, Rosario, Susan, Justin, Kris. Thank you for the introduction, the invitation, and the organization of this talk. This talk is part of the last exhibition about silverware from the New Spain in Spain. Thanks to the invitation of Pablo Amador and his unconditional support, I curated the exhibition that took place between November and February at the Casa de México in Spain. The works on display are an example of the legacy of Spanish migrants in New Spain. Although these pieces have been shown in some publication and other exhibition, the interest in reflecting on each pieces and go to a little beyond the tradition studies of silverware from New Spain. In this talk, time will only allow me to talk about some pieces, but firstly, I want to consider some aspect of the silver mark that made possible the identification of the pieces from New Spain. I am referring to the silver mark of the cajas reales that collected taxes relate to the silver pieces. In the case of the New Spain, the most frequent silver mark shows the columns of Hercules with an indigenous hat among them and over the initial of Mexico City, or another initial related to some of its province. And a crow is on top of the composition. Precisely, this mark provides insight into my proposal and gives the exhibition its title. We know that the columns derive from the blazon model established by Carlos V and thus are taken from the Hercules mythology, who places the columns in the Straits of the Gibraltar with the motto non terrae plus ultra. There is not land beyond. In this way, beyond is not a limit. It opened a window to the challenges caused by adventure, glory, and the birth of one of the most important chapters of the links between Spanish and America. For this talk, I proposed that the plus ultra columns were signified the Mexican silver mark and associated with the extraction and production of silver. To support this relationship, let's take a look to the visceral paintings, specifically those canvases that represented the Virgin Hills as an allegory of the wealth of the Potosi mines. The painting of the Art Museum of the La Paz, Bolivia, exhibit that under the protection of the Holy Trinity. The Virgin Hills is flanked by two columns that are above Pope Clement with a cardinal and a bishop, while at the opposite side, Felipe XV is depicted with a Knight of the Order of Santiago. The plus ultra found a destination, and that were the reach of the discovered lands, represented on the hills of Potosi as a space consecrated by Maria Purity, who acts as intercessory of the reach of the territory. Likewise, the columns also allude to the duality that established the order, the religious and the profane, the crow and the church, the king and the pope. In this silver mark of the New Spain, the columns from the destination in the initial letter of the city, which recalled to an emblem made by Martin Burrua. I fortified your columns, where the hills of Potosi is flanked by the columns sized by the Inca. The same compositional elements we saw in the New Spain marks. Therefore, it is possible to understand that it's not only an indigenous force that straightened the columns. It is also the allegory of America topped by the Spanish crow and at the same time by the Holy Trinity. The locality mark, more than a sign or payment of taxes, is also assigned to distinguish the pieces for the journey and its own history. It is mark of the objective destiny of the plus ultra. In that sense, the religious pieces are dualist expressions of devotion to the glory of the good and the aggrandizement of the kingdom. This is the starting point to justify that each silver object bequeathed by the migrants should have been a careful considered selection to express their faith and the reflection of the successful miracle of prosperity in New Spain. As an example, the exhibition begins with an allegory sense related to the plus ultra. It is the silver columns donated by Narciso Agustín de Viguer y Antonia de León to the Order of Santiago, Order of San Juan de Dios in Cádiz, Spain. The relationship I established is due to the shape of the column and the geography where Hercules placed one of his columns, thereby commemorating the end of his 10th work. In this sense, the silver column is seen as a symbol that celebrated the triumph of the trip. This allegory let me link the moralistic mythology of Hercules with the virtues of Christ. Just Hercules Farnese reads after his work and meditates leaning on his mace as a column, showing the most human part of the demigod. Kris is seen in the same meditation position is the moment after the scourger that he received tied to the column and before his presentation to the people as ex homo. This is the man. In one of his most painful scenes in which he shows, like Hercules, his humanity. Now, we cross the metaphorical threshold of stylistic limits to give close examination to New Spain silverware in order to place each piece within its context. The example below is the chalices that the scholarship has called Scurialense style that recalls ornamental austerity or courtier style due to the supposed taste and promotion made by the Spanish court. The styles can be seen in the most remote churches of the Spanish American during the 7th century. As an example is the chalice in San Pedro and Aguilillas, Cusco, or the one from Oaxaca, Mexico, to mention a few of the many ones located from the Hispanic America. The fact of the existence of these designs in distant points, it is possible the result of factors related to a standard that exceeded the taste for a style. In this sense, we believe that the spreading of this king of chalices is related to the influence of San Carlos Borromeo and his instructions published in the years 1577 about the chalice he wrote, it must have strikes and decent decoration with nothing to attract attention in the lace while it is celebrated. A recommendation that is repeated during the 17th and 18th centuries in books for the ceremonials of the messes. About this, I believe that the design of these styles of chalices is caused by a greater interest than aesthetic taste. In this sense, the shape of the pieces from this period remains fixed despite the diversity of the taste. In relation with this, I exhibit a group of the chalices linked by his shape and related with different production centers. The first is a chalice made in Spain by Juan Bautista Herrera in 1620 and has an Hebrew inscription. This is a consequence of the reuse of the chalice by Jewish community in the 18th century. The piece is a sample of the ornamental austerity and although the Kindus inscription results from the Jewish ritual, its translation is not far from the Christian. Blessed are you, Lord or King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. And this chalice, both materiality and ornamental, respond to principles and values of different social and cultural groups. The other chalice is made by the same silversmith and the same years dedicated to the chapel of animals that Inca Garcilaso de la Vega founded in Córdoba, according to the inscription that is at the base of the chalice. This work transcended the memory of the society, moving from the architecture to objects made after the death of the Peruvian rite, and therefore to the aggrandizement of those who grant his type of the object through the name of Garcilaso de la Vega. The third chalice is a gift for the King of Spain, the symbol of the gratitude for the appointment politicans of the Viceroy of Peru and New Spain. The chalice was made in Mexico by order of the Viceroy of the New Spain, Gaspar de la Cerda, with the silver extracted from the Laicacota mines in Puno, Peru, sent by the Viceroy of Peru, Melchor Portocarrero, commissioner of that mine. The importance of this object is that the Viceroy's through that a chalice was a mean to express its gratitude to the divine and early majesty for political favors. It is also an example to verify that taste is excelled by decorum, since the shape follow the proposed correct design. In short, the chalice has equal shapes within the stylistic context. However, the distinction results from the careful choice of design and the material made by the Viceroy. At the same time, it is important to say that the chalice was expression of the devotion to the divinity and the king, fulfilling the political and religious aims suggested by the fortunate commission of both personages. With the purpose of going beyond the result of the shape or a style in the silverware, I present other pieces where we can separate the use religious, social, or political. Examples of these are the monstrance of the Puebla de Los Angeles with anthropomorphous stem, the representation of saints, angels, and Virgin on the monstrance stem was traditional to be an original Mexican creation, but now I suggest it has a Central European influence, specifically from the Habsburg territories. I refer to the emblem representing the monstrance with an angel on the stem, made in the abbey of the Wittenhausen, located in the south of the present-day Germany, and published in the 1687 in the book Mundus Symbolicus by Filippo Piccinelli. This is the image that I propose as a model of Spanish-American anthropomorphic monstrance. Thanks to this finding, the emblem with the title Maximo in Magno, the greatest of the great, it is possible to see in the silver monstrance the figures that are allegorically linked to the Virgin Mary as the only that she called contained to God in her bosom. This double meaning, Eucharistic and Mary, led used to review visual reference of the time. For example, The painting located in Sinazla, Oaxaca, Mexico, this work depicts the portrait of Our Lady of Mercy, La Peregrina de Quito. It is pertinent to attend in this painting the great variance of the iconographic tradition that characterizes the representation of the Mercy. I refer to the monstrance that she has in his hand, and that make direct reference to the text of the painting. For example, our salvation is your hand. From the fruit of your womb I will put on your throne. Or the heaven could not contain him, you contained him in your chest. The closet present is the devotion to the Immaculate Conception and Corpus Christi that marched in Ecuador, painted in canvases by Miguel de Santiago. This iconography is the sublimation of the two great dogmas, the Immaculate Virgin and the transubstantiation of the body of Christ, in combination and symbiosis of Corpus Christi with the Immaculate and the Crow. According to this, we have a visual reference that helps us to reflect the importance of these two dogmas. This is the stamp made by Pedro de Villafranca. Here, Maria de Austria gives the crow to Carlos II, with two images hand on the wall. On the left, the Immaculate Conception with the inscription, Patron of Spain. On the right, the monstrance with the inscription, Patron of the House of Austria. I consider that the Virgin is the logical container of the body of Christ, as well as the monstrance. I propose that the defensor of the Eucharistic that promotes the reign of the House of Austria and the defense of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception be present in the monstrance of New Spain. So, monstrance has a ranging beyond religious purpose that relate to political and royal promotion. As reflection, in this small sample of the exhibition, the generation and stylistic limit in the studies of silverware in New Spain had been questioned. With the proposal, I pretend to go beyond the limits of style to start new rendering that help you see each piece. I will start from this exhibition to give continuity to the research and to overcome the limits of the studies of the history of silverware in Spain. And at the same time, I intend to influence the interest in a shared heritage between Mexico, Peru, and Spain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrés. This was fabulous. I have one question just very quickly. If you can keep your camera on. You mentioned that in Peru, in Mexico, and in Spain, and I guess also in the United States, most of the studies on silver has been emphasizing style. So I want to know, we can do it you can respond in Spanish, and I will do my best to translate. What are the implications of now focusing on materiality and use and the sources as you are doing now?
Bien,
puedes responder en español y yo traduzco si es necesario.
Ok, igual te respondo en español, creo que va a ser más práctico para que no tardar esto. Sí, la propuesta es ver el objeto desde múltiples puntos de vista, comenzando por la importancia de la materialidad, como es el caso del cáliz regalado al rey, ¿no? Pero además...
his proposal is to present this from a material point of view as the chalice that was presented to the viceroy.
Sí, pero además de esto, al poner la pieza en diálogo con la pintura, el grabado o la literatura, nos lleva a ver la platería como una imagen, como si fuese una pintura, ¿no?
His goal is to put silverwork in relation to or in dialogue with painting, text, prints, and other sources in order to conceive silverwork not only as an object, but rather as an image.
Sí, bueno, en ese sentido, bueno, la imagen que forma el objeto ya tiene una forma propia y por lo tanto los elementos decorativos son parte de esta imagen también, ¿no?
And in that sense, therefore, the decorative elements become part of the image.
Sí, entonces, bueno, creo que lo principal que tener en cuenta es de estas piezas es el uso, ¿no? de la pieza, el uso religioso, el uso político, el uso social, pero a esto sumado la materialidad.
So his main purpose is to emphasize the use, the religious, political, or social use, but also focus on the materiality. And with that, I'm going to go back to Kris, who is going to present. Thank you, Andrés. I will see you in 15 minutes or so. Kris Lane holds the Franz V. Scholes Chair in Colonial Latin American History at Tulane University in New Orleans. He is the author of Potosi, the Silver City That Changed the World, which just appeared a couple of years ago in 2019. He also is the author of Color of Paradise, The Emerald in the Age of Gunpowder Empires in 2010, and Quito 1599, City and Colony in Transition in 2002. Thank you so much, Kris, for being part of this webinar.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Rosario, and thank you, Susan Dean Smith, for the invitation. Thank you also to Justin O'Connor for help with all things technical, and to my previous speaker with whom I'm sharing the stage, Andrés de Leo. Andrés has given us a great introduction to the materiality of silver objects as they circulated throughout the Spanish Empire. And in this case, we're going to go right back to the source. So it's a segue to where the silver came from. Not all of it, of course. There's a San Luis Potosi in Mexico, but it's named for this one. This is Potosi in Bolivia, in the highlands of Bolivia, at about 4,000 meters above sea level, or a little over 12,000 feet above sea level. It seems like a sleepy city today, at least early in the morning on a Sunday, but it's a vibrant city, and it's the capital of the department of Potosi, a very large province in southeastern Bolivia. Mine workers are still the kind of soul of Potosi and the most potent political force there. Their numbers have dwindled over time as mining has become more mechanized, but they are still really significant. And they're significant in part because of this mountain, the Cerro Rico, or the rich hill of Potosi, that looms over the city and still defines it. It's a really stunning mountain, and you can see how deeply scarred it is after all these years, nearly 500 years of continuous mining. If you take a tour of the mines, get underground, you might encounter mine workers still using fairly simple hand tools to drill blast holes. This guy is working with hand steel, single jacking, drilling a hole for a dynamite charge. And you can see his cheek is full of coca leaves, which is the kind of fuel that has kept Potosi miners going since probably pre-colonial times, certainly in colonial times. The mines today of the Cerro Rico are mostly in the hands of cooperatives, and these are miners and descendants of miners who worked inside Potosi during the time when the mountain was run by Comibo, the state mining company. And now they have carved out their different sections and they hang on to them. But the story begins in 1545 when an indigenous miner from Peru named Diego Hualpa testified later in life that he had discovered the riches of the Cerro Rico when sent to the top of the mountain by his Spanish overseer to search for Inca treasure. And what he found instead was pay dirt. he was working at the mines of Porco, not too far away. And you can see in the map on the left, Potos C was soon connected to both the Atlantic and the Pacific by the Royal Road, the Camino Real, in the south, exiting into the Atlantic at Buenos Aires, and in the northwest, reaching all the way to Callao, the port of Lima, and also Arica in what is today northernmost Chile. Potosi and Porco on the right, you can see down there in the lower right, were among many mining camps, Oruro, Chayanta, Aujagas, and as Andrés mentioned, Laicacota, which is near present-day Puno on Lake Titicaca. But it was the Cerro Rico that really captured the imagination of every visitor because the city and the mountain seemed to be a unit. The bonanza was such a great thing, such an amazing thing, that it became world news. It passed around thanks in large part to this 1553 engraving made from a sketch by Pedro Cieza de Leon, who visited in 1549. And his image was copied numerous times by English and Italian and German and French engravers. And then an artist in the Ottoman Empire rendered it thus, kind of turning Potosi into a green paradise, very different from what you just saw, with, of course, Ottoman-style structures with their lead roofs and crenellated walls around the city. Indigenous images also, you saw one image that Andrés, it's the Murua manuscript, but I'm attributing the image to Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, who rendered it in his letter to the king in the early 17th century in a very similar way, showing that the mountain of Potosi was the support for the columns, the pillars of Hercules, the support for the Spanish Empire. A darker vision of Potosi emerged with the engraving of Theodore Debris in the History of America from 1601. And this was used as propaganda against the Spanish to show that they were uniquely cruel and greedy, and that the extraction of silver from Potosi was a way of exposing the excesses, not just of the conquistadors, but the kings of Spain. The image, if you read the description by the Jesuit Jose de Acosta, who visited Potosi, actually follows his verbal description quite closely, even though the image is pretty impossible physically. Potosi silver then circulated around the world, and tales of Potosi went along with it. First across the Atlantic to Europe and into the Mediterranean, but also after 1571 across the Pacific Ocean to Manila from Acapulco, with feeder lines heading up from Lima. So Potosi silver would go from Peru to Mexico and then across the Atlantic or across the Pacific. Much of it went to India or to the Mediterranean, to the Ottoman and Safavid empires and the Mughal Empire. But Ming China was really the heavy hitter at this time in terms of size and complexity of its economy, something that is true in our own lifetimes, with something like a quarter of the world's population or more, and a fairly sophisticated tax system. China needed all the silver it could get. The Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci, along with an assistant, created this massive woodblock map using an original by Waldseemüller. And his South America, or their South America, actually has, both in the caption and kind of in the middle of the continent, Bedushi. And in the caption, it's Bedushishan, Potosi Mountain. Which takes us back to Potosi, the city, the gridiron plan from 1603 that's at the Hispanic Society of America, gives us an idea of a city emerging at the base of the mountain. Very quickly, Potosi had a population of over 100,000 people. And you see what looked like boulders around the edges of the city. And I had a map maker render that plan in English to help show my students what it all meant. But you can see it kind of maroons these numbers around the outer edges, and those are the parish churches of the rancherias, the indigenous townships. And so what I was calling boulders, I think might have been bohíos. So if you think of those instead as indigenous dwellings, you can imagine then the population being much larger than what was claimed. That same document contains this memorable image of the Cerro Rico with llamas heading up and down the mountain workers as well, some overseers on horseback, and in the foreground, a silver refinery using the new technology of mercury amalgamation introduced in the 1570s. And this really transformed Potosi and turned it into something much different than it had been in the 1550s and 60s. An artist helped me render this from a crude sketch of mine to try to show how silver was produced from the mines to the refineries, starting with the ore coming out of the Cerro Rico being selected and sorted at the pit head by women and brought down to the mine, to the refineries by llamas, where it was crushed and added to various reagents, including mercury, and finally squeezed out, retorted, all of these different technical processes to yield big bars of fine silver. Potosi then, as an industrial kind of city, continued to thrive well into the early 17th century. And yet, as this image from 1630 or so shows, there were also indigenous wind furnaces, or huayras, apparently still operating. You can see them in the lower left. So indigenous technologies, European technologies, hybrid technologies, innovations in the colonies, all of them come together to make Potosi a giant machine. And this is the term that many people used when they visited Potosi and reported back to the king or to anyone else. They would say, this is a great machine, and it functions by consuming and producing at a level not seen before. Potosi ran 24 hours a day. The miners worked in shifts, day and night. The mills ran all night long as there was water to supply them. And so this was a place that really had a schedule distinct from any place else in the Spanish Empire, and perhaps in the world at the time. It was noisy, it was dirty, it was contaminated, but it was also a place of great beauty and great wonder. And the machine was really powered by water. This is a high desert, and it required the capture of water, snowmelt from the Karikari Mountains, into large a system of reservoirs that then were connected by aqueducts to the city itself. You can see in this painting from the 1750s, the artist has sort of lifted the Karikari Mountains in the background to show all of these reservoirs that supplied water to the aqueducts just to power the mills, and they're mapped on the right. All to say that Potosi, in its heyday in the 17th century, really beginning in the late 16th century, was a kind of industrial complex that involved massive transformation of the natural environment and putting, of course, thousands of indigenous workers into harm's way, many of them exposed to rockfall, cave-ins, mercury exposure, and much worse. The product of all of that labor, all of that destruction looks like this. Essentially two types, bar silver above and coin silver below. The bars were supposed to be 60 pounds. Sometimes they got to be as big as 90 pounds, pretty much as much as a mule could carry 2 or 3 of these. They're very, very heavy. And the coins then would ship out in bags containing 2,200 pieces of 8 carried by llamas or by mules. And that silver then, and the silver economy, really articulated the entire continent of South America in the 17th century. And it continued to do so into the 18th century. Potosi remained important, and Portuguese Brazil was under Spanish rule until 1640. Even after its independence, it relied on Potosi silver. The king of Spain, or the kings of Spain, spent a lot of that Potosi silver on these sort of silver bullets, as I'm calling them, trying to fight the Dutch, trying to fight the Ottomans, trying to fight the French, trying to fight the English. All of these battles were very expensive and absorbed a considerable part of the fortune produced in Potosi. There were also great building projects, such as the Buen Retiro, the palace for this king, Philip IV, which today is just a park. The palace is gone, but at least there's a great park left behind. Much of that silver as I said, went to the Low Countries, where some of it was minted in Antwerp or in Brussels. The great entrance to the Antwerp Mint, the new mint designed by Peter Paul Rubens, was his last project. And some people claim that the project kind of overwhelmed him and in fact caused an early death. Either way, the Cerro Rico was imagined as this inexhaustible source of silver. And other Europeans then kind of picked up on that image, I guess updating it from the time of Cieza de León, creating ever more fanciful images, Baroque images of Potosi and the Cerro Rico. On the right, this image by the Dutch artist Arnaldus Montanez. He had heard that there were furnaces and there were mills and there was wind. And so he put it all together to make windmills. Being Dutch, he assumed that windmills would be producing silver. And off in the distance, you see a field of windmills on the right. And that because it's in the tropics, Potosi must be warm and have palm trees and scantily clad African men in indigenous dress, anything you could imagine. Well, those dreams of Potosi then translate into various projects. And one of those projects after the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century was the English South Sea Company, which intended to make money by getting enslaved Africans to Potosi via Buenos Aires. And so investors were given maps like this with the Potosi inset at the lower left to get them interested. It turns out that among those early slave ships coming from West Central Africa that arrived in Buenos Aires, at least one of them apparently unleashed a pathogen that passed from Buenos Aires up through Cordoba along the Camino Real all the way to Lima, and really blasting through Potosi between early 1719 and 1720. And this pandemic, this Andean pandemic, was really crushing on top of all of the obligations of labor in the mines. It turned out that Potosi, its own production, was kind of bottoming out at this time. This was just about when Potosi silver mines were yielding their least amount of silver, and it would take a while for the industry to recover. Just before that pandemic hit Potosi, a new Archbishop Viceroy happened to visit the city. And this painting by Potosi's most famous colonial artist, Melchor Perez Holguin, gives us a sense of that, the grandeur. This picture is enormous. So if you get to visit the Museo de América in Madrid, you must see it. It's about the size of a bus, and it captures pretty much every detail. What's often forgotten is that same Archbishop Viceroy also left with a lot of silver. We have verbal descriptions of all the gifts of silver that were given to him, and he sent some of that material back to his hometown in La Mancha in Spain. And so if you get a chance to visit the tiny town of Villa Robledo, go to the Virgen de la Caridad, and you'll see this enormous plinth holding up the Virgin. On the front are indigenous women carrying lunches or dinners up to their mining men folk. There are llamas on the side going up and down the mountain. And there are also men with their little backpacks climbing to the mines to go to work. It's a pretty massive piece of silver. In the end, the great pandemic was really crushing, as I said, to Potosi, but in the mid-18th century, the city started to return to great wealth, and a new cycle began. What it all came down to then was silver, how best to spend it. The desires of the Virgin competed with the demands of the King of Spain. And yet the story didn't stop. The Potosinas continue to break these rocks in search of a little bit of silver, and somehow the Virgen del Cerro still provides. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris. This is amazing how in 15 minutes you could kind of make a summary of the history of such an important town. And my first question for you before we are joined by Andrés. I mean, you present a very clear panorama of how globalized the world was at the time, but also how overwhelmingly present was the silver of Potosi in every corner of of the world. But I wanted to know if this imagination, no, of European imagination was also aware of who was making all the hard work. Was there any conversations about indigenous labor, no, beyond the presentation of the Cerro Rico? Was there's more information being shared about the rough conditions in which silver was being extracted?
Yes, in fact, there was, at least within the Spanish Empire, there was a lot of debate from the very beginning. One of the first priests to visit Potosi was Domingo de Santo Tomas, and he described it as a mouth of hell, and immediately said that the kings of Spain are going to be fighting with the devil for their conscience because they have inherited this treasure that is also a burden. And whether or not they really cared about individual Andeans who were mining, that they never got down to that kind of level of detail, but they did say that this is a moral hazard that is on a scale we've never seen before, and would be comparable ultimately to African slavery. It would be something on that scale. That and so that debate goes on for a very long time. The forced labor system known as the mita was debated all the way through the colonial period, but ultimately it was retained. It was finally Simón Bolívar who eliminated the mita. That's how long it lasted. So the kings of Spain never gave up on mistreating indigenous workers. That's pretty much what it came down to.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you consider a lot of individual cases of real people, that you found in records. And I want to make a comparison because Andrés is looking for specific objects, no? So I want to make a parallel between specific people working in the city and specific objects that were made with silver from from Potosi, but also other places, no? And in terms of how we can learn or make a bigger or more detailed picture when we decide to go case by case, no? And just want this open question for the two of you before we start considering questions from our audience.
Well, I can just briefly say that it's the only way for us to connect to the past, I think, effectively, if we can relate or we can imagine someone's personal experience or imagine an object and its particular history. And through the particular, we get to the general. Otherwise, I think we risk compressing time and compressing the complexity of these places and events. And I clearly compressed a lot. It's always a hazard to do that, but I think through objects and through life stories, we can make connections and we can see that could have been me, or I could have touched that thing, or I might have seen it. And seeing it in a museum really brings it home when you actually see those chalices. Just the chalice that Andrés showed, the Garcilaso chalice, that contains so much history. It just encapsulates a huge story. And I think that's the beauty of the particular.
And it takes us also to the makers, the silver myths, and that's my little joke in the title of this talk. But let you say something, Andrés, if you want to add to why it's important to focus on a specific objects like the one that you talk. You are in mute, Andrés. So first.
Sí, te lo voy a decir en español, me ayudas a traducir, por favor. Sí, creo que la importancia de estos estudios de objetos específicos radica en conocer las historias propias de los objetos, pequeñas historias que conforman una gran historia, ¿no? Como la producción, ¿no? a la que se refiere Kris. Y creo que al unir estos dos elementos, ¿no? La materialidad, la importancia de la materialidad de las minas, como la de Laicacota en Perú y la de Potosi Bolivia, van cargando a los objetos particulares de cierta esencia, ¿no? Perdón, me fui muy largo.
Now I'm the one in mute, sorry. So he's saying that it's through the short stories of specific items is that we can really make large histories that would enlighten, you know, our understanding of and how these processes came about. I want to go to questions from the audience. Lucia Querellasu, hola Lucia, says that she finds very valuable to see silverware as part of the production system and in parallel with the other arts. I think it's worth considering the way that silversmiths had compared to other trades. And I think this is very, very interesting because they work with them, ¿no? Cubriendo retablos, por ejemplo, pero tenían quizás cierto estatus un poco mayor. Entonces, si puedes, Lucía quiere saber, y creo que nosotros también, si quieres llevar por ahí la investigación y cuál es la relación con otros oficios que te has encontrado en la investigación.
Sí, bueno, los oficiales, digamos, los maestros que trabajaban los metales, hay una rama diversa. Entre los artísticos estaban los batihojas, los que batían las láminas para dorar, y plateros de oro y plateros de plata. Entonces, bueno, la idea que tengo es...
Let me
sí.
So, that there is different, I don't know if this is even necessary, but I think it's better if I do it so we can really engage with audiences in the US as well. Although I'm really happy that we have people from Chile and Bolivia and Mexico and other places. Anyways, so he's saying that we have, there were different workers of silver, no, artisans, those who work with making the very thin sheets of gold that were used in sculpture and in retablos, in the altarpieces, and they were also the silver meats of gold and the silver meats of silver.
Sí, y bueno, la idea es, la propuesta es colocar los objetos de la plata, ¿no? Los objetos de platería, en un discurso paralelo, conforme se están haciendo a otros soportes como la pintura o la escultura, ¿no? Entonces, creo que, bueno, a lo que se refiere Lucía, un saludo también, es que sí, pretendo atender, digamos, a los productores de plata, de objetos, ¿no? De plata, relacionándolos a la par de cómo se están estudiando la pintura o la escultura.
He indeed aims to compare, you know, how the silver meats work with other media, you know, and explore that. And now I have I'm going to combine two questions for Kris. Mary Davis says the picture diagrams you put together of the actual process were fantastic. I'm curious about the history of the creation of silver objects pre-conquest. Did Andeans also use mercury and follow similar physical processes? And also Magdalena Pereira wants to know if you have found in your research how silver was reduced to avoid taxing. And if you have found many cases in the 17th century about this kind of fraud, being done to avoid taxes.
Excellent, thank you for these questions. The pre-Columbian processes were different. There's very little evidence of use of mercury before the arrival of Europeans, except in amalgamation. Cinnabar, the red pigment that is made from mercury sulfide, was used as a kind of paint, and there's plenty of evidence of that, and it goes way back. And there's some suggestion that mercury was used to amalgamate gold dust but not for silver, as far as we know. Not that's introduced or developed by Europeans. In Mexico, in fact, that process is really elaborated. In the case of objects, religious objects, for example, there are many, many examples or cases of people having lamps, silver lamps. I haven't seen custodias or monstrances, but I'm sure those were also made. But it was very common for someone to purchase an ingot of silver that had not been taxed, take it to a silversmith, have it made into some religious object, and then have it packed off to Spain without being registered. So there's quite a bit of evidence of that. And the shipwreck of the Atocha, which produced the bars that you see, gives us examples of that. There are plenty of objects that were not registered and so not taxed.
Related to that question, and I guess you answered already, Peter has asked how significant was the production of silver artifacts in Potosi? Did the mines attract silversmiths from Spain to work on silver? And how important was this economically in comparison to exporting simple silver lingots? And related to that, I think, because it goes to materiality, Catherine McCallan asked if you think, Andrés, that the inscriptions in the objects inform viewers about the movement of silver. So, Kris, if you want to answer first, how many objects were made in Potosi?
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll just be brief and say that plateria was alive and well from the very beginning. So you had silversmiths training enslaved Africans, training Andeans. So we have silversmiths that are European, African, indigenous. Some we know their names, some we know very well. And yes, there's a very large business in doing this. And the churches in Potosi proliferate very quickly, and they quickly have the biggest lamps in the world. There's the one in the cathedral. It's just the big church. It's not yet a cathedral in Potosi itself. In 1600 or so, it's already so big that it requires a special winch to lift it. It's got so much silver. So yes, there's a local plateria that's quite advanced.
And Andrés, let me just ask my own question before you answer the issue of inscriptions, because we have to start wrapping up. You mentioned that Gaspar de la Cerda commissioned one chalice, and that he wanted specifically to be from Puno. And my question there is why he wanted Puno and not Potosi? Why not Zacatecas? Why, and why this awareness again of the world? And, because he wanted his name attached to that specific item. So if you can link that, with the inscriptions, which are kind of the memory of that patronage, no?
Yes. Sí. El cáliz este cáliz es un objeto muy bien pensado. Y resulta que Gaspar de la Cerda llega a México como nuevo virrey y Portocarrero lo envían al virreinato del Perú como virrey. Al mismo tiempo, Portocarrero le conceden la comisión o administración de las minas de la Icacota de Perú, y con la plata que extrae de estas minas se manda a hacer este cáliz.
So let me say that Garcia de la Cerda arrives exactly at the time with the previous viceroy is sent out to Peru, and he is the one administrating the Puno silver mines, and that's why they decide to do this very well thought artifact.
Yes. Sí, creo que lo importante es la selección del material y la selección del objeto. Que este objeto, que un cáliz, ¿no?, sea el objeto seleccionado por dos virreyes para agradecerle al rey un favor político, ¿no?
So he finds very interesting indeed that these two viceroys in two different locations, New Spain and Peru, are being thoughtful to choose the location and the right item that they want to give to the king as a way of acknowledging his power and to say thank you for all the political favors received. And I think it's interesting, no? Because then it's like he doesn't really care about maybe Potosi, but he wants to connect to the new Portocarrero, I'm guessing, wants to connect with his new position. And therefore, that's why he wanted Puno. That's my guess. ¿Es cierto eso? Que como era el administrador, por eso escogió Puno.
No, bueno, él justo en el momento que le dan al parecer, Portocarrero no veía muy bien irse al virreinato del Perú, pero le conceden un plus, ¿no? Que es la administración de la mina de la Icacota, ¿no?
Okay, so the Viceroy Portocarrero wasn't very happy of going to Peru, and so the fact that he became the administrator of the mine then was kind of a way to make him happy, and so that's why he wanted to choose the mine, that specific silver. That's very interesting. I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to wrap up. Freya Rojo asks Kris if you have found silver work of Potosi in Manila.
Well, no, but that's not because it isn't there. It's simply because I haven't looked. I know that a lot of Potosi silver went to Manila. We're quite certain of that. Whether or not silver work produced by silversmiths in Potosi ended up in churches in Manila, I'm less certain of that, but I would not be surprised. There were a lot of priests in Potosi, and they moved objects around with them as they traveled. And it would be quite common for a priest to be reassigned to a different part of the empire and to take this kind of object. It's also very common when elites traveled. So say a corregidor or some other official would be moved to a different post. Mm-hmm. They would take a number of these kinds of objects with them. You saw that the Archbishop Viceroy of Peru took or sent this very large Cerro Rico to his hometown, where it still is. So that's the way silver kind of circulated in an artistic economy alongside this monetary economy that I gave more attention to. So I would not be surprised.
And one more question from Juliet Versema. The opposite. She's asking for something different, and I think it's fascinating. Is there evidence of the import of Colombian gold or platinum circulating in Potosi?
Yes, gold is coming, but gold is mostly coming from Carabaya, at least what we know, what's clearly named. But finished jewelry is coming from Nueva Granada and Quito, sometimes with emeralds and pearls. The emeralds are definitely from Muso and Chivor in northern Colombia. And those objects, you could find some examples, crosses for the Virgin, for example, that are in Sucre today that were in Potosi churches originally. Yes, the short answer is in notary records, you also find merchants and other people sending gold and emerald and pearl items from other parts of Peru to Potosi. So it is a market, both for wealthy women particularly. It shows up in their dowries, it shows up in their wills. And also indigenous women of African descent that have jewelry, they often will say, I have emerald sortijas de esmeralda con oro, ta, ta, ta. It's clearly that's been fashioned probably in New Granada.
Thank you. I think it's fascinating to learn more about, all the different aspects of silver. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I think it's clear that silver it's a topic that we need to learn more. We were just chatting before we went when we started the webinar that there There was a huge conference in Colombia a couple of years ago. Now there's going to be one webinar organized, or a conference organized by the British Academy and the University of York, the matter of silver, that is taking place in July. Some colleagues have been publishing extensively on silver, and I think it is because we need to include them, include it in the large conversation of our historical artifacts, and how they influence the world back then. Thank you, Kris. Thank you, Andrés. Thank you, everybody who joined us. I want to say that we record public programmings like this distinguished visiting speakers talk. We are going to share them at the Blanton YouTube channel, which you can find in a week or so. Please consider joining us next Thursday, May 27, for our membership team conversation or yummy little event that we're going to try to match cheese from Antonelli in Austin with works of art at the Blanton. We're also having curated conversation, drawing inspiration, on June 8th at 5 p.m. as well, where our Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs, Carter Foster, and his curatorial assistant, Christian Wurst, will talk about our new paper vault exhibit and the usual way in which it is hung, which reminds me a lot of what Abby Barbour wanted to do in terms of thinking of images in a more free way. So for our historians, I think would be very, very useful and inspiring. It's a wonderful exhibition we have now. And if you enjoyed tonight's talk and would like to show your support to the Blanton, you can become a member or give a gift of membership at blanton.org/membership. And finally, if you just want to always be in the know about our programmings like this one and others, please sign up for our newsletter at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. I think that is all. It was really a pleasure to have you and to learn so much from both of you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And we're going to share our fall programming in months to come. So please be in tune, and thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.